Hi everyone in Science and Values. In this brief video, I'm going to explain just some general tips for writing a philosophy paper. Um, Not necessarily specific to any of the prompts that you have to choose from, but simply for anyone writing a philosophy paper, these are some things that I would tell them. So these are not necessarily specific to any of the three prompts that you have to choose, though I will reference the prompts at various points. The first thing to think about is kind of what is the goal of a philosophy paper? Why write a philosophy paper? Um, a philosophy paper is not that different from a traditional argumentative essay that you've probably had in either English classes in high school or writing or composition or English classes in college. So you may have written an argumentative essay before. One of the biggest differences, I think, for a philosophy paper is the use of the first person. So, I'm going to sort of talk about that throughout this video, the importance of relying on the first person in a philosophy paper. But to answer the question, what is the goal of a philosophy paper? The goal of a philosophy paper is to make a claim and to defend the claim and to convince the audience of the claim that you make. The claim, I call it a claim, but that is the more well-known, is more well-known by the name of a thesis statement. So the claim you're making is sort of given to you up front. The claim that you're making is given up front to a reader in the introduction to the paper. So, for example, you might say, in reference to the Sandel prompt, you might say, in the following paper, I will argue that Michael Sandel's claim, or I will argue that Michael Sandel's argument against moral enhancement is not convincing. I will do so first by showing X, by doing X. So, sort of just that really basic language. This is not, I'm not asking you to reinvent the wheel here and come up with some kind of super catchy introduction. But the thesis statement in a philosophy paper must contain the words, I will argue, because that's what you're doing. You are making an argument. You, though. You're not, and that's why the first person comes in, because it is you trying to convince the reader of your position that you have. So, in this case, I'm not asking you necessarily to come up with an original argument because I'm giving you these prompts. And so in each prompt, there are sort of one or two positions you can take. There's a basic dilemma that's being presented to you. And so you can choose from kind of what's given to you already. I'm not asking you necessarily to come up with an original thesis, but there is some, it does depend a bit on you. You have to decide for yourself. Do you find Michael Sandel's argument convincing? Do you find Paul Feyerabend's argument convincing? Do you think that the scientists that you're choosing, if you're choosing prompt 3, do you think they acted responsibly in the way that they communicated with the public? So you that's where your voice enters the paper, is it's you're deciding yourself what position you're going to take in relation to the dilemma that's being presented in each of the three prompts. So let me say then a little bit about the organization of the paper in terms of just this, because you can tell on the rubric I'm grading you according to introduction, body, and conclusion, which I know seems kind of formulaic, but um, because in a philosophy paper you're making an argument. An argument more or less should have that basic structure. That basic structure going all the way back to what you were taught when you're first told to write a paper. The introduction is your chance to preview as clearly as you can for a reader what you will do in the paper. Preview it step by step in the introduction. Because it wouldn't make sense to just jump right into the argument. A reader wants to, you need to convince a reader why it's worth their time to listen to what you have to say. And the way that you're going to do that is by previewing your argument. And you can have a brief statement in the introduction, kind of telling a reader why the topic matters. Have one or two sentences that just kind of capture really briefly, why does this topic matter? Not because you've been told you had to write a paper for your class, but these topics matter. All of them matter beyond the context of this class. Some of you may think that the problems matter less than others, but they all matter. The problem between science and democracy, the problem with genetic enhancement, the problem with scientists communicating in potentially untrustworthy ways to the public, they're all problems that matter in our world right now. So you can have just one or two sentences along with the preview of your argument that simply tries to tell a reader why these matter. And don't say things like, since the dawn of time, philosophers have been asking these questions. Try and, if you had to convince a reader why they should care about this problem, what would you say? So have that in your introduction. And then that should be your introduction. Your introduction should tell a reader why this topic matters, and then to just have as broad an outline as possible of the major steps of your argument. So in the following paper, I will argue, and then that would be your claim, whatever position you've chosen. And then you can say something like, in order to defend my claim, I will first do this. Having done that, then I will do this. And finally, I will do this. You should be that explicit, that on the nose, so to speak, about what you're doing, so that the reader comes away from the introduction with as clear a picture as possible about what they can expect to see in the body of the paper. Because if I'm reading your paper and you told me you were going to do one thing in the introduction, but then I look at the body and you're doing all these other things, I'm going to say, but you told me in the introduction you were going to do this, and you're doing this other thing that you never told me you were going to do. So your introduction is the promise to a reader that you will actually follow through on a plan, and that you won't sort of steer off course with that plan. Let me say something about the body of a philosophy paper. I'm not going to get into, because again, the way you organize this will be slightly different depending on the prompt that you choose. But the one overarching thing I want to say about a philosophy paper is that you should try and do each step of the argument one at a time. You shouldn't be trying to do two different things at once. One of the most common errors I see in a philosophy paper is that you're trying, so if, again, this is really simple, but if you have, for example, in the introduction, if you say, I will first do this, then I will do this, then I do this, but then when it comes to the body of your paper, you're doing them all at the same time, well, that's not an argument. An argument is a reasoned, step-by-step procedure where one thing follows from the thing that came before it. That's what needs to be happening in the body of the paper. So do A, finish A. Tell your reader you finished A. Then tell your reader, I'm now starting B. Do B. Finish B. Again, I realize that this seems on the nose, which is to say a little bit too obvious. But this is important. It's called, the general name of what I'm referring to here, it's called signposting. Signposting is so important in an argument because the reader will know exactly where you are in your argument. You can't assume that the reader knows where you are unless you tell them. That's why the use of the first person is so crucial. So let me just kind of say something about, for any of these prompts, part of what you're being asked to do is to explain the arguments of the things we've actually read for this class. So I think that is a logical place to start in your paper, is to start with the arguments that like the material that we've done in this class. Present that. Present it as clearly as you can. Do that first. Don't just repeat the book. Show me that you understand it. And again, this is a crucial difference. This is not an exam. So don't present the material in a way that is simply as if you were responding to an exam question, where the goal is just to list as much as you know as possible. You're not responding to an exam question. You are organizing the information in a cohesive way and presenting it to a reader. Whereas on the exam, you're in kind of a timed situation and you just want to kind of get everything down that you can as fast as possible. Whereas in a paper, you've got weeks to do this. So I say this because this is a common mistake I see in student writing, is that in particular on the section of the paper where you are presenting the class material, you just list as much as you can. And it reads as if it's an exam answer and not a paper with an argument. So be sure, in particular, in the section of the paper, when you are presenting either Feyerabend, Michael Sandel, or whichever approach to communicating science from Heather Douglas or Kevin Elliott, whichever of those, present that first, directly quoting the text selectively when you think it's appropriate, and kind of having that be its own section of the paper. Do that and have that be its own section. Then you can move into defending your thesis, which is, you'll see there's this second part where I ask questions. In the case of Paul Feyerabend, I ask, so let me take a look at the prompts here. In the case of the Paul Feyerabend prompt, I ask you, should science be more democratic? And then in B, I say, through the use of some pandemic-related example, show how science failed to be democratic. So that's where, after you've presented Feyerabend's argument from the reading from the class, then you can go into those two. But don't try and go into that until you've done the other thing. Try to not do two things at once. That's so crucial for an argument. It's a step-by-step procedure. And then the last thing you should do, and I have this for all three prompts, is you must consider an objection. And this can't simply be a throwaway section. You're getting specific points for not only presenting an objection, but responding to it. Often, students, they don't make this a throwaway section at the end of your paper. Don't just have a real quick conclusion, or don't just have a real quick statement of an objection and then a quick response. It needs to be a developed section of your paper. I'm grading you on that because the general point is your argument is only ever as good as its ability to respond to objections. Anyone can just talk and talk and talk and throw information at you. And then somebody comes along and says, but what about this? Have you considered this? And they say, well, no, I haven't. But I just told you a bunch of other stuff, so isn't that good enough? No, I mean, I think this is self-evident for all of you that an argument, the whole nature of an argument, is that it considers opposing viewpoints. That's just a basic principle of argumentation. So that section of your paper cannot be a throwaway section, and I will take points off if it feels like you just rushed through it at the end of the paper. So you must think about a good objection to your argument and then respond to it. I need to see both happening. You don't just present the objection and then move on. So present the objection and respond to it. So as far as I can tell, there are three major sections of the paper. There's the part of the paper where you present the material from the class that we've learned. And you don't want to spend too many pages doing that. Try and do it as succinctly as possible. Present that in a kind of systematic fashion. Then get into your argument, your thesis, based upon what you've just presented. So kind of the way it would make sense is, I have just presented Feyerabend's argument. Now I will show why I agree with his argument, or I will show why I disagree with his argument. And that's really where the meat of defending your thesis comes into play. Once you've done that, and that will definitely constitute the longest portion of your paper, then you are going to want to have the last section. And you can say, now that I have defended my thesis, I have considered some objections to my thesis. And you only have to do one. You can do more than one. But and here's how I would respond based on my thesis. And that would be and then you would have a conclusion. So that's kind of how I see the paper playing out. For all of the papers, there is outside research required. You must locate some outside academic sources, and you must locate some popular sources. The popular sources, I think, typically, for all of these, I think you can find things. Look in the science section of the New York Times. Look in the science section of different newspapers. Don't find Wikipedia articles. Don't find blogs, things like that. They can be editorials in the newspaper. That's fine, but they need to be, they need to come from actual print or digital sources. They can't be, something that Joe wrote at 3 in the morning about why he hates Dr. Fauci or something like that. So the outside popular sources, you can Google for those. Those should be not hard to find. And then the academic sources, you should use JSTOR. JSTOR is an academic database that you can locate through the library's website. For JSTOR, if you go and you make sure you do an advanced search in JSTOR and you scroll down the list and checkmark philosophy for the advanced search, and that's where you're gonna find the most success. Just type in the general search terms, and I guarantee you will find things. But your academic articles must come through using JSTOR. That's the quickest and easiest way to find them. You shouldn't use Google to find your academic sources. So they must be reputable, and they must come from JSTOR. They don't. If you don't know how to use JSTOR, contact me. But they are pretty straightforward. So let me just say something then real quick about quoting in the paper. You need to directly quote, right? Meaning that in this you need to directly quote this text. If you're doing the Kevin Elliott prompt, you also need to directly quote the Sandel article. You also need to directly quote the Feyerabend article. You cannot just paraphrase. You cannot just put page numbers in parentheses. You need to directly quote all of the outside sources in your paper. So this is a skill. You need to effectively integrate the quotes into your writing. It can't just seem like, oh, this was a requirement for the paper. I had to do this outside research, so I found this thing and I jammed it into this section of the paper. I checked the box on the rubric that said outside research and I'm done. No, notice on the paper that I'm asking you to effectively integrate the outside sources. So that's going to take some skill. You may need to dig around a little bit and figure out, how do I want to effectively integrate this? It needs to fit with your writing. And believe me, I've read enough student writing that it will be obvious to me if you just are trying to check a box for the outside research. It will be very obvious to me. So let me just, so the primary sources for our class need to be directly quoted, and all of your outside sources need to be directly quoted as well. I need to be able to go to your works cited page and know which of the outside sources you're referring to in the paper. You should not quote any more than 2 or 3 lines if you can help it. There should not be, in fact, if you have block quotes in these papers, I will take points off. These papers are 6 to 8 pages. So for something like that, you should not have block quotes. And if you have block quotes, I will take points off. I will simply draw an X through them. And I will say, this, you do not need to be quoting this many lines. It will just look like you're trying to take up space. So no block quotes. That's kind of all I really have for this. It's going a little longer than I wanted anyways. But I just want a few big picture things. Introduction. All the introduction should do is, why does this topic matter? What are the broadest strokes of my argument? That's it. And your introduction should maybe take up at most half of the first page. Do not have your introduction going beyond that. You'll notice on the rubric it says, does the introduction sufficiently introduce the reader? Well, the reason I have the word sufficiently is because you can do so over sufficiently. You can take it onto the second page, so it shouldn't do that. So you'll lose points if you do that. Body, just be sure, the body of the paper, just be sure that you're kind of following through with what I said. Present the primary text argument, defend your thesis, respond to an objection. And then the conclusion, simply just review what you did in the paper. And the use of the first person. The use of the first person should appear in the introduction, in the transitions to the paper, and in the conclusion. And I think that's about all I have. If you have any other questions, you can ask me via email, or you can ask me during one of our Zoom meetings. And I wish you all luck on the paper.